I now invite Mr. Herman Kraft from the Philippines to argue for the motion, which is that nationalism always wins.
One concern that I have is that whenever Filipinos participate in this debate, it's always an academic who's actually participating. Academics do not make good debaters. They make good lecturers, but not debaters. But having said that, I think I need to remind the House about the motion. This is not about the idea of why nationalists should not be afraid of regionalism, right? The motion is that in a contest between regionalism and nationalism in ASEAN, nationalism will always win. So the main consideration here is that in those kinds of contexts wherein the choice is between a national, the idea of national interest, no, and a regional context, no, then it's the national interest which supersedes the regional context. That's the motion, and I am here to speak in favor of the motion. Now, my colleague has already spoken about how this particular motion is reflected in the context of the economic area in ASEAN. Now, my main point, I think, is that if we actually look at the process whereby nationalism has actually guided the process of regionalism in ASEAN, no, as my colleagues actually mentioned, okay, quite a number of things are actually placed there. Okay? The issue that he actually pointed out was the importance of things like, for instance, sovereignty, non-interference, no? In other words, norms that actually make up the constitutive context of ASEAN. Now, the point is, if you look at ASEAN now, and we're looking at ASEAN in the context of the Charter, okay, those particular points, no, that made nationalism, no, the foundation of ASEAN's regionalism, remain embedded in the Charter. In other words, nothing much has changed as far as those particular norms in ASEAN. Hence, it is not likely that ASEAN, no, that in ASEAN, no, anytime soon, regionalism will be trumping nationalism. Let's look at things in particular. The ASEAN Charter continues to affirm, no, some basic norms, okay, that have been constitutive of ASEAN. If you look at the ASEAN Charter, no, the emphasis has been on cooperation, no, which has been the original point as far as the Bangkok Declaration is concerned. Okay? But as well, you have the emphasis on non-interference, more importantly, no, the respect for sovereignty. Now, maybe it's not so much that we're actually concerned with non-interference here, in as much as ever since 1997, no, the challenge to the non-interference norm has actually meant that, no, we now see in ASEAN more openness in terms of criticizing, questioning, no, our neighbors. However, what comes out really is that even if we criticize, no, this does not guarantee that there will be something that can be done by ASEAN as far as, no, other member countries are actually concerned. Okay? So in that context, no, sovereignty remains a primordial concern. Okay? You can see this, no, in particular with the point that was made by the Prime Minister in his speech about the conflict between Thailand and Cambodia, for instance. No? The choices about where are we going to bring this conflict. Okay? The nationalist option here, no, was really, let us ignore ASEAN, let us look at, no, other options, no, that might be more advantageous to us as far as a conflict resolution mechanism is concerned. Now, this is made even worse by a number of procedural norms, no, that continue to be part of, no, the way that ASEAN operates, the so-called ASEAN way. Okay? Central to this, decision-making. No? It remains based on a consensus means of making decisions. Now, the AEC blueprint, if we look at it, no, actually reflects some alternative recommendations on how decisions could be made, such as a 10-X kind of arrangement. No? But the interesting thing here is that instead of actually emphasizing regionalism, in fact, these alternative mechanisms, no, show the extent to which nationalism cannot be subordinated to regionalism. Right? In other words, in the context of national interests not fitting in with with the regional agenda, the national interest is allowed its own way. Okay? Now, look at the idea of binding decisions, and the issue of compliance within ASEAN. Again, this is another issue that's quite interesting. There is no context within which decisions in ASEAN are actually binding upon its members. To a large extent, those decisions, when it comes to actual compliance, depends on the willingness of the member states to actually proceed with, determining when, and how it's actually going to be done. Again, nationalism trumps regionalism in that context. Okay? If this kind of decision-making process actually leads to any conflict between the member states, what comes next is a conflict resolution mechanism. You don't have a clear one as far as the ASEAN Charter is concerned. What you do have is, again, the idea of having the members choose a forum wherein this kind of conflict might actually be resolved. Okay? Now, if that doesn't work, then the whole thing is actually passed on to the summit to make a decision on the issue. And in the summit, of course, you're back to consensus. Right? So it's an interesting process whereby nationalism, to a large extent, remains embedded in the way that the regional process actually works. Okay? But outside of this, you do have structural factors influencing these kinds of issues as far as ASEAN is concerned. In other words, not only are we talking about institutional mechanisms, we're talking about structural issues within ASEAN that favors nationalism. Okay? Earlier, Mr. Jaime Sobel de Ayala actually talked about the idea of the confidence within ASEAN from the period of 1995 to 1996. One thing that we forget, of course, is that in 1995 to 1996, we were talking about ASEAN 6. Okay? ASEAN 10 did not occur until, of course, 1998. Now, why is that important? Within that context, the members of ASEAN had developed over time a confidence in each other. Okay? Built common ideas, in such a way, like-mindedness had already developed. Okay? With ASEAN 10, it increased the level of diversity and divisiveness within ASEAN. Okay? There was a need now for them to actually go through a process of learning against socialization, etc. So that when you look at what has happened with the ASEAN Charter, the three communities that are actually being discussed, to a large extent, the issue of nationalism keeps on trumping the way that regionalism is actually presented in ASEAN. When you look at the political security community, for instance, you have, in this context, the idea of an ASEAN Intergovernmental Human Rights Commission. Okay? A commission that unfortunately is very weak as far as protection mechanisms are concerned, precisely because, again, of national sensitivities. In economics, you have a two-tiered ASEAN, wherein you have to actually be sensitive to the gaps between the original ASEAN 5 and 6, and then the new members. The hope must be with the cultural community. But even within this context, the fear is that the idea of ASEAN has not penetrated deep enough, so much so that you can actually counter nationalism with a broad regional identity built at the grassroots. So we may be talking about in closer to ASEAN 1, but unfortunately, we are not close to it yet. Thank you.
I invite now Mr. Khairy Jamaluddin to debate against the motion.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, like my esteemed opponent, I'd like to start by reminding ourselves what this motion is, debating against the motion. This House believes that in a contest between regionalism and nationalism in ASEAN, nationalism will always win. Will always win. Those are the three most important words in this motion. Not whether or not nationalism wins most of the time, but will always win. If you look through the sweep of history, you will see that nationalism is but a blip in human civilization. Nation states, nationalism, dominated 20th century, maybe the 19th century. But for most of the time, even if you look at imperial powers, empires, regionalization was a function of their survival. Regionalization, reaching out, working with other people, conquering states, that has been the default mode of cooperation between peoples in human civilization. Who are we to say that just because in this very small period in human civilization of 30 years, that regionalism or nationalism will always win against regionalism in ASEAN? Let me just put it into context again. My esteemed opponents were very, very astute in categorizing the birth of ASEAN. But let's just go back to the birth of ASEAN. They said that the birth of ASEAN was already compromised because regionalism was deeply flawed in the original model with a lot of concessions towards nationalism. But I would argue that nationalism was woven into regionalism. Neither won. Neither nationalism won, nor regionalism won when we started ASEAN. Because we have to remember that when ASEAN was formed, there was deep suspicion amongst member countries, the original member countries. There were deep suspicions among each other. There was a threat of communism, common threat of communism throughout the ASEAN states. And it was ASEAN, that commitment towards regionalism, that secured their nationalist desires. The nationalist desires for non-interference, for security, for the respect for boundaries. That came because of a strong sense of regionalism. So there was no defeat of regionalism just because there was a strong sense of assertion of nationalist rights, but nationalism was protected by regionalism when ASEAN was formed. So I think even if you look at ASEAN itself and the history of ASEAN, we cannot say that nationalism has always won. And if we look at other examples, we were given examples just now of how nationalism always or frequently trumps regionalism in ASEAN, but I'll also give you some examples. And I say this in the context of the voting that took place just now. About 83% have this biased view that nationalism trumps simply because ASEAN is weak, ASEAN Charter is loose, the ASEAN institutions are ineffective, we don't have a supranational body like the European Union. But take, for instance, cases in which regionalism has really trumped in the face of nationalistic considerations where governments had to decide whether or not they went with the greater good of regional integration and progress and prosperity or pandering to nationalistic sentiments at home. Focus on, for instance, free trade or fair trade. Let's take the example of Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam. We always talk about trade in terms of being unfair to the less developed countries. That's why we talk about free trade not being fair trade. But consider this. Consider Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Myanmar. They risked by reducing their trade and tariff barriers within ASEAN under AFTA. They risked losing government revenue from tariffs in the CMLV countries are between 7 to 25% of the government budget. Quite considerable. But yet, when we study what happened in 2010, we look at the tariff barriers in the CMLV countries, almost 98% have been brought down to the levels between 0 and 5% as per AFTA. And that is a strong commitment from governments and countries which faced considerable problems and considerable resistance in losing government revenue and also in opening up their markets when they thought they were not ready. But that commitment showed that regionalism trumped in even the most difficult circumstances. My esteemed opponents also mentioned in conflict resolution, this whole business of taking conflicts away from ASEAN to other places where they would be adjudicated, where there would be arbitration, is some way, in a way, a defeat for regionalism. I would disagree. Disagree. Let's take a few examples that I'm familiar with. Let's take the example of Sipadan and Ligitan in 2002, when Malaysia and Indonesia took this case to the International Court of Justice. Fine, we didn't adjudicate it at ASEAN because we don't have the platform to bring the case to ASEAN. But that doesn't mean that regionalism was defeated by nationalism. It meant regionalism won because of this concerted effort to keep the peace between the two countries. And God knows the naval exercises that were being undertaken by both Malaysia and Indonesia in Sipadan and Ligitan in the Ambalat Islands prior to the case being adjudicated by the ICJ was an indication that strong nationalistic pressure was put on both governments, by the military and by the public, to make sure that there was no concession, including referring these cases to the International Court of Justice. When Malaysia won, Indonesia accepted it, and the government did their best in trying to calm down nationalist backlash in Indonesia. Similarly, in the case of Pedra Branca or Pulau Batu Putih, between Malaysia and Singapore. Although we didn't refer it to ASEAN, similarly because there's no platform, we both, Singapore and Malaysia, referred it to the International Court of Justice. Why? Because of this belief that we live in an ASEAN region together and that we must protect the peace, and there must be this commitment towards each other no matter what the nationalistic pressures are in Parliament, in the Malaysian Parliament, in the Singapore press, against each other and against each government. And ultimately Singapore won Pedra Branca and we won the Middle Rocks next to it. Accepted, and we had to calm the nationalist sentiment down at home. And the same goes with what was mentioned by Prime Minister Abhisit just now about Tanjung Pagar. Tanjung Pagar is a station in the middle of Singapore, Malaysian land, the last bastion of Malaysian land. The nationalistic pressure not to give away this land was tremendous. But ultimately the government said, in the interest of regional cooperation, win-win, prosper thy neighbor, ASEAN style, we're going to swap this land with a joint development with Singapore. Unheard of, but because of this belief that regionalism must triumph nationalism if we are to get on better together. So ladies and gentlemen, those are some of the examples that I want to give. I leave you with this one note, since I only have 40 seconds, is that will it always win? Will it always win? Coming back to how I opened up, will nationalism always win? I've already demonstrated that nationalism doesn't always win, but will it win in the future? No. The simple logic of it, which my esteemed teammate just now mentioned, is that we are a small country if we consider ourselves just one member of ASEAN. But if we are to survive in a world with the ascendancy of China, India, with pressures from all over the world, then we must be together. And ultimately, that logic will prevail. If today it doesn't prevail with the majority of people in this room and outside, it prevails with the governments of ASEAN, as seen with the examples that I've just given. Thank you very much.